All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the video lecture for Unit 5 in the Buddhism class. And in this unit and the next one, we are going to be making a significant turn in our exploration of the Buddhist tradition. We are going to be charting the way in which the Buddhist tradition, as it proliferates outward from northern India and the original teachings of the Buddha, um, it spreads across the subcontinent and then jumps over to Southeast Asia and then goes across the Himalaya Mountains into Tibet, into China, and then into Japan. And as that whole story unfolds over say about 1,000 years after the presence of the historical Buddha in the world, Buddhism undergoes lots of transformations and changes, and it diversifies in significant ways. As you can imagine, happening with a traditions that's encountering so many different new cultures, um, being transplanted into different regions, encountering different perspectives. And then within the Buddhist community itself, there are debates and disagreements and different kinds of interpretations of the Buddhist Dharma that are happening. Different forms of practice, different kind of personages come to the fore. Um, it really becomes an incredibly diverse phenomenon, Buddhism, as it unfolds. You might recall one of our theorists from the very beginning of the class, from the Beginner's Guide to the Study of Religion, Wilfred Cantwell Smith. And Wilfred Cantwell Smith engaged in a pretty pretty trenchant criticism of the idea of categories in the study of religion, and he questioned even the category religion itself and whether it might be kind of misleading about trying to capture what it's supposed to characterize and describe. But he also extended that critique to the names of the labeling of world religions. And his criticism was often that categories that we tend to use in English to kind of encapsulate these different worldviews, like Buddhism, for example, really are misleading because in many cases, and this is a perfect case in point, when you say Buddhism or you say the Buddhist world, there's no single monolithic entity that is Buddhism. There's no central headquarters of all Buddhists. There's no pope or there's no single scripture or creed that all Buddhists adhere to. There are simply many different interpretations and many different schools that we kind of capture with this umbrella label Buddhism. It's not to say we shouldn't use the term Buddhism, but we should simply use it advisedly. And that's what we're going to explore in these last couple units of this class, just scratching the surface of the way in which Buddhism, the Buddhist tradition, has diversified over the centuries. And, classes like this, we use labels, to obviously to designate them. But if I had my druthers, I'd probably want to call the class Buddhisms, right, rather than the single monolithic label Buddhism. So this is just something we should keep in mind. And again, in these last couple of units of the course, we will build on all of the conceptual work and historical work that we've already done, really tracing back to the origins of the tradition and the historical Buddha. But we will see that this is a perfect case in point of what Wilfred Cantwell Smith was talking about when our labels seem to suggest singularity when actually what's present on the ground is pretty significant diversity. So let's start with a basic and kind of traditional way of understanding the way that the tradition begins to diversify within the couple centuries after the historical Buddha's death. And let me share the screen here and we will chart out these differences. There we go. So the basic concept, the basic distinction that's often drawn, a starting point for thinking about the way that Buddhism diversifies, is to think about one branch of the tradition that goes by the name of Theravada, and then another branch of the tradition which goes by the name Mahayana, right? So, just to bring this into focus, Theravada Buddhism is generally the form of Buddhism that's practiced in Sri Lanka, and it's predominant in Southeast Asia. And just to give you a visual on this, Theravada Buddhism was the Buddhism that was portrayed in the long search video that you watched in the last unit when you were thinking about following the Buddha and what it means to follow the Buddha, right? So that video was filmed in Sri Lanka, and the dominant form of Buddhism there is Theravada. Theravada literally means, that label means the way of the elders. And so Theravadan Buddhists have a pretty singular linear focus in terms of the way that they understand Buddhism and following Buddhist Dharma. And it traces straight back to the historical Buddha and the things that the historical Buddha did and said, and the example that he set, right? And during all those decades, those 4 decades of teaching, he left behind a lot of messages and a lot of lectures and a lot of sermons and a lot of dialogues. And for Theravadan Buddhists, though all of that material that was generated by the historical Buddha provides the basis for a body of scripture and the way of life, the proper way of life, and the proper philosophical understanding that Buddhists should follow. Over the centuries, these texts become collected in a body of scripture called the Pali Canon, after the language in which it's written, namely Pali, which is a spin-off of Sanskrit, basically. Um, and so their idea is, to be a Buddhist, you can consult those scriptures, you rely upon the example of the monks, the Sangha, right? And follow the example of the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, the individual that we studied in some depth earlier this semester. So you may say to yourself, well, what else would you do if you're a Buddhist, right? Well, as we're going to see, there are different ways of understanding the Buddhist path, and that's where Mahayana comes in. Now, almost immediately, after the Buddha's death, there are some disagreements, right, and some debates about the nature of Buddhahood and about the core teachings of the Buddha, and there are philosophical discussions and divergences, right, among the Buddhist community. So from the very beginning, there starts to be some kind of schisms and divides, right? It doesn't get to the point where people start killing each other over it, right? But there definitely are schools that develop over the next, say, 300 years after the Buddha dies, right? One of those interpretations eventually becomes what would be called the Theravada tradition. And then there's a whole proliferation of other ones, many of which are captured by the label Mahayana, right? So what exactly distinguishes Theravada and Mahayana Buddhists? Mahayana itself, by the way, is a big label, as we'll see, which captures many different interpretations. But just we'll go with the simple binary at this juncture. Well, this is what we're going to delve into. Um, the first distinction is simply geographical. And as I mentioned before, Theravada Buddhism dominates in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. And then what becomes Mahayana, or the different forms of Mahayana, dominate in East Asia, so in China, Japan, and Korea. And really, properly speaking, in Tibet as well. And you'll read some you'll in some of the readings you'll be focusing in on Tibetan Buddhism. Um, there are some versions of the story will suggest that Tibetan Buddhism is a third branch of Buddhism, um, and it does have its unique qualities, etc. But in terms of its philosophical basis and its orientation, it really has Mahayana kind of conceptual background to it, right? So there is some debating, semantic debating about whether it's a third form of Buddhism on its own or it's a derivation of Mahayana Buddhism. But generally speaking, Mahayana forms of Mahayana Buddhism are dominant in East Asia, Central and East Asia. Okay, so when it comes down to it, what are the different forms of emphasis in these different branches of the tradition? Now, as I mentioned before, for the Theravada Buddhists, the focus is on Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha of our age, of our time. Theravadan Buddhists actually acknowledge that there are other Buddhas, but they simply don't emphasize those figures and emphasize the teachings of the historical Buddha, the most recent one, Siddhartha Gautama. So really one Buddha, right? For Theravadan Buddhists. In the Mahayana tradition, there is an acknowledgement of the existence of many Buddhas, and these Buddhas have much more significance, right, within this tradition um, than they do within the Theravadan tradition. So it's a recognition of the existence and proliferation of enlightened beings. The logic is something like this. If the Buddhist kind of time frame is an infinite time frame in essence, right? Buddhist cosmology kind of goes back forever, right? In a sense, there's no like in the beginning, God created the world kind of stuff. It's a very long scope of time, right, within the Buddhist concept of cosmology. Um, there certainly must be other beings who have attained enlightenment, like Siddhartha Gautama did, right, 2,500 years ago or so, right? There must be more of these beings who have accomplished this tremendous but still possible role. That's the whole point of Buddhist teaching, right? Is that enlightenment is available to all sentient beings if we want to get on the path. So, there must be many enlightened beings out there somewhere who have accomplished this same task. And in Buddhism, these Buddhas are thought to generally often reside in some very special celestial realm out there somewhere. They're just out there in the cosmos, kind of existing in their enlightened state. Um, and thus, they, in some sense, populate our cosmos just as we do, right? And just as Siddhartha Gautama did. So the idea of the Buddha proliferates, right? And that means that there are other Buddhas who might be helpful and worth paying attention to, according to Mahayana Buddhism. So we can explore that. Whoops, by moving forward a bit. But we'll have to rewind here. You'll recall this image, right? The wheel of samsara, the bhava chakra, the wheel of being or becoming, right? And you remember Sarah McClintock's lecture about the bhava chakra. And it gives us a helpful basis for understanding the different ways in which the Buddha is conceived in Theravada versus Mahayana Buddhism. So here's your standard Bhava Chakra, and you remember all of the different pieces of the pie here, right? From the land of the gods to the land of the warring heroes and anti-heroes, divine anti-heroes and heroes and anti-heroes, the asuras. We have the realm of human beings here in the top left quadrant. We have the realm of the hungry ghosts down here. I think the animals were down here in the particular painting that we looked at with McClintock. And then over here we have the realm of the animals, and then at the bottom we have the hell realm, right? And then we have the segments of codependent arising in the outer circle, and the god of death, Yama, embracing this whole thing, signifying to us that this is samsara, and samsara is ultimately something, regardless of our stage, that we would want to flee according to Buddhist teaching. Now, for our purposes, in this video lecture, what we want to pay attention to is actually the figure here at the top right. And I hope that you recognize that that is Siddhartha Gautama, that is Shakyamuni Buddha, our historical Buddha, the one who transcended the realm of samsara. And you can see here in this particular image, he's depicted as utterly distinct from or outside the realm of samsara. He has, in some sense, departed our world. He's still extending his gesture of peace and blessing to all of us down here. But in this imagery, he really has, in some sense, kind of left us behind and is off on his own, uh, nirvana like journey. And then on the top left, you actually have the moon, which is often associated with as a symbol of enlightenment within Buddhism. So this seems to match with our picture of the way Buddhism works so far. We're in samsara. If we get on the Buddhist path, we have the possibility of attaining better rebirths through merit and good ethical action, through insight, meditation, etc., and understanding of Buddhist Dharma. We might progress closer towards what is our ultimate goal, which is transcending this cycle altogether. Then we can be like the Buddha himself and jump out, right, and escape and leave it all behind in some really basic sense, right? Now, while we're still on this image, something very important, a detail is very important, that appears in the other version of the Bhava Chakra that we studied in that earlier unit, namely that there's a Buddha in that other version of the image. There's a Buddha in each of these realms. Remember that? So a Buddha appears in each of these realms to try to help people out, right? Or help these entities out. There's even a Buddha who's down there in hell, trying to help people out of their predicament and their situation. That's that's a move that echoes the Mahayana orientation of that version of the Bhava Chakra that we studied before, right? It suggests that the Buddha's the number one, there's more than one Buddha, right? Because there's a Buddha in each of these realms. And number two, um, the Buddhas haven't left the building, right? Buddhas are coming back to our realm out of compassion to help us out, right? So they're not just checked out like this Shakyamuni Buddha that we see in this image, but Buddhas actually have the power to come back into the realm of samsara out of compassion to lend us assistance. Now, the original historical Buddha kind of did something like this, because after he attained enlightenment, he could have just checked out at that juncture. But out of compassion, he came back to the real world, right? Our world, the human world, um, and and engaged in teaching and dialogue and community building for 40 years, right? So the historical Buddha, it's not that he is not compassionate and uh, just simply wants to get out of the building. He also engaged in this gesture. That gesture is now in Mahayana Buddhism expanded, right? And gets applied to a multitude of Buddhas, right, who also have something to offer us, right, in the realm of samsara. So I think this visually kind of gets the point across. Here's the kind of Theravada orientation, right, where we have Shakyamuni Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, same figure, just a different name, right, at the center, and then we have devoted, enlightened followers all around him, right? That is figures who are striving to follow his ideal and who have themselves become enlightened because of their advanced pursuits or their direct contact with the historical Buddha. But this is more like the Mahayana view, right? This is what's called a Buddha field. And yes, Shakyamuni Buddha is in the center of this image, right? But he's connected, right, to all of these other Buddhas who are aligned all around him. And the logic here, the suggestion is any of these other Buddhas could be at the center, and Shakyamuni could take his place in the ranks, right? And so all of them could be in that central position, and we can visualize each of them moving into that central position because each of them has something important to offer. Okay, so um, oh, sorry, let me give you an example, right? This is Amitabha Buddha, right? And Amitabha Buddha is one of these figures, right, that emerges as Mahayana Buddhism develops and um, kind of wins a popularity contest in a sense, right, among all of the Buddhas. They're all important, but this one um, seems to attract a very uh, um, convincing and enthusiastic following over the centuries. This is the Buddha of Paradise, or the Pure Land, as it's called, the Western Paradise. That's his realm. So he has somewhere back in the annals of time attained enlightenment, right? And then he took up residence in the Western Paradise, right? And thus he becomes the focal point of a sect of Buddhism called Pure Land Buddhism. And the idea behind Pure Land Buddhism is that, and we'll get into this in a moment, that, you know, everyone needs alleviation of suffering, right? And waiting until we've attained some, advanced state of monkhood or advanced kind of through many lifetimes, through much asceticism effort, eventually we attain some sort of relief and eventually broach nirvana. Um, Mahayana kind of fills this void, right? And this kind of need to democratize that message a little bit because, after all, the Buddhist message is everything is suffering and everyone undergoes suffering. So, wouldn't the core message of Buddhism really be everyone deserves to have that suffering alleviated in the most expeditious way possible? And Pure Land Buddhism picks up on that and suggests that Amitabha Buddha is reaching out to us, right? Or extending his powerful compassion and grace out to us, right? If we only accept it. And so the central ritual of Pure Land Buddhism is actually chanting the name of Amitabha Buddha. And as Pure Land Buddhism unfolds in China and Japan, his name changes a little bit, Amitabha in China and Amida Buddha in Japan. And in Japan, the saying, right, is called the Nembutsu, and it's Namu Amida Butsu. And you simply chant the name of Amida Buddha with sincerity, calling out to Amida Buddha to alleviate your suffering, and here's the crucial thing, to bring you out after you die of the realm of samsara and bring you to his pure land, to his paradise, right? Which is not nirvana exactly, but it's a place that's a lot easier, right? It makes it a lot easier to practice the kinds of things that in Buddhism you need to in order to attain nirvana. So it's kind of this holding place in a sense, right? Um, that whole thing, though, in terms of the Pure Land being a, state of preparation or a better place to work on attaining nirvana, kind of goes by the wayside in Pure Land Buddhism, and the focus is actually just getting to the Pure Land itself for most practitioners. Um, so this is kind of interesting and a kind of twist on Buddhism that might be a little bit unexpected because remember in Theravada Buddhism we got a lot of messages that are like you have to do this for yourself, right? There's no one else who can do this for you, right? Even the Buddha can't help you. Buddhist Dharma can't tell you how to do it ultimately. You have to rely upon yourself and you're alone ultimately in this pursuit of enlightenment. Um, in Pure Land Buddhism, it's really kind of the opposite. What you have to do is you have to give up, right, on your own ego and your own egoistic pursuit, right, and your own striving and all this kind of thing, and utterly open yourself up to the compassion and grace of the other power, namely Amitabha Buddha or Amitofo or Amida, right? Buddha. Um, so here we have an interesting twist. Now you can see how like this message can also fit with Buddhism because when you rely upon someone else's power utterly and totally, what you're doing is you're demolishing kind of the idea of self and of ego, right? So you're completely deconstructing that idea. And that, as we have learned, is a crucial foundational Buddhist message. So you can see how we might get to this point, right, in one of the most important and most influential and most populous branches of the Buddhist tradition, all the way up to today. Many Pure Land Buddhists, and they have temples in New York and they have temples across the world. So it's a very prominent, not at all obscure interpretation of Buddhism, and many people have membership in it. And here's an image of a beautiful, I think, Japanese image of the Pure Land, the Western Paradise. And you can see here, if you look closely, you have people kind of hanging out in these beautiful gazebos, and they're hanging out by the lake, and they're meditating or they're chanting together. It's kind of like like a spiritual spa, right? It's you can, wander the grounds and just all of your cares and pains and suffering are taken away, leaving your mind clear to really absorb the Buddhist Dharma, right? And it's all come to you through the grace and the power of Amitabha Buddha. So we go back here. Sorry, this got a little disorganized. There we go. Okay. The next um, clear conceptual difference that we want to talk about is the concept of the bodhisattva. And the idea of the bodhisattva, literally that word means on the way to enlightenment, being on the way to enlightenment, right? Enlightenment being, right? Um, and so we have run into this concept before in traditional Buddhism, or in the foundational Buddhism that we have studied, and in Theravada Buddhism. This is how it's recognized. The Bodhisattva is really, that term is really strictly applied to the historical Buddha and one of his previous lives. So you might remember when we looked at the Jataka tales, where he manifested as Rupavati and as the swift goose. He was identified as the Bodhisattva, right? And that's just the Pali for this word, Bodhisattva. Uh, he was on his way to becoming the Buddha, right? So he's on the path. So this term was closely identified with the Buddha himself, the historical Buddha, in his previous lifetimes. In the Mahayana tradition, the concept is expanded. Pretty much anybody who is getting on the Buddhist path is in some sense a bodhisattva. If you start learning Buddhist doctrine and you start engaging in Buddhist ethics and following Buddhist doctrine and meditating and things like this, in the interest of alleviating your suffering and the suffering of others, in keeping with the Buddha's teaching, you're kind of a Buddha on the way, maybe a long ways off, right? But you are a bodhisattva. You're on the bodhisattva path. Um, but there are, in the Mahayana tradition, there are some very advanced figures, right, who are extremely far down the road, right, in terms of Buddhist practice and Buddhist Dharma. And they become kind of superheroes unto themselves with their own backstory and also with their own powers, right? And so I say they're quote unquote saints with salvific power. There are some comparisons to be made between bodhisattvas and the saints, say, of the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church in Christianity. Bodhisattvas tend to have like realms, right, that they preside over. And they also are people that you reach out to and pray to when you need particular kind of help. So let's move back here and introduce ourselves to a couple of bodhisattvas. This is a fairly famous one. His name is Maitreya, and he is the next Buddha. He is conceived as the next Buddha. So he's out there somewhere in our world or in the cosmos, and he's getting super duper close, right, to attaining enlightenment, and he's going to be the next one to come down the road. Um, he is he's the central in a number of different forms of Buddhism. Some forms of Buddhism identify this Buddha as a kind of apocalyptic figure whom we're anticipating, who will usher in a new Buddhist age, right? So we have that kind of strand in Buddhism, like we see in other religious traditions. He's associated with prosperity. So, as particularly in China, he takes on this more puffy form. And you've probably seen this figure in restaurants in New York City or elsewhere, right? He is associated with Maitreya, the Bodhisattva, who is the next Buddha down the road and can bestow blessings on you, right? Kind of retroactively if you call out to him. But the quintessential, and there are bodhisattvas, there are dozens and hundreds of different bodhisattvas who preside over different realms and take different kinds of vows. And the vow, the vraja, is extremely important in thinking about what the bodhisattva is all about and what the bodhisattva means for Mahayana Buddhists. Um, Bodhisattvas kind of generate their power not only from their advanced status, right, but also a commitment that they make, right, which is quintessentially Mahayana. And this bodhisattva, it takes the biggest vow of them all, right? Um, the Sanskrit name for this figure is Avalokiteshvara, which is a mouthful, right? But if you break it down, you've got kind of two words there in a compound, Avalokita, right, which means looking down, right? And then Ishvara, which is the Sanskrit word for Lord. So this is the looking down Lord, right? And by looking down, it means he's looking down on us in a sense with compassion, right? So the Bodhisattva is very much attention is very much focused on us, right? In a compassionate gesture. And so he has a backstory story and is extremely advanced, right? Obviously, and very, very powerful. So powerful that he has many actual kind of superpowers in a sense, right? According to the Buddhist tradition. But the most remarkable thing about Avalokiteshvara is that Avalokiteshvara takes the grandest bodhisattva vow possible, namely that, and just think about the kind of weight of this, that even though he is on the cusp of enlightenment, nirvana himself, that is escape from the realm of samsara, right? He vows not to attain enlightenment and escape from samsara until all sentient beings are able to do so as well. So that includes like the vast infinitude of sentient beings that are out there in our world, right? Avalokiteshvara says, I will not go over, as it were, until I can bring all other sentient beings along with me. So that's a pretty intense vow, almost like an infinite impossible vow. And yet he does it with all sincerity. And so, in order to accomplish his goal, Avalokiteshvara remains in the realm of samsara and comes back again and again and again in a whole variety of different forms in order to try to accomplish that particular goal. So, Avalokiteshvara, and you can see an image of Avalokiteshvara here on the left with all of these hands reaching out, and then all of this brilliant, kind of all these rays of brilliance coming out of him. The hands are signifying, reaching out to all different kinds of people, um, and trying to bring them up and bring them along, so such that they can eventually escape the realm of suffering. Now, Avalokiteshvara is originally a, Northern Indian Buddhist figure, right? So Avalokiteshvara is a Sanskrit word, but as Buddhism spreads, particularly in East Asia, right? He undergoes some interesting transformations. Part of the kind of malleable nature of South Asian divine religious figures, right? That they can take on different forms, like Vishnu can take on different avatars. And Avalokiteshvara manifests in a bunch of different ways, right? In order to attain the goal of trying to bring people along, right, towards nirvana. So it kind of makes sense that as Avalokiteshvara moves to different contexts, he takes on different forms. And when he arrives in China, for example, Avalokiteshvara takes on a feminine form, namely Guanyin, probably melding with a Chinese kind of divine figure, goddess, etc., and also fitting maybe with cultural ideas that the feminine is more associated with compassion, right, or something like that. There's speculation about how this transformation happens, but in any event, Guan Yin becomes associated with the Bodhisattva of compassion when Buddhism arrives in China. Um, when Buddhism arrives in Japan, and this is like 800 or so ish of the Common Era, about 1200 years ago. Sorry, the Avalokiteshvara kind of myth comes along with it, and Guan Yin transforms into Canon, right, which is again going back to kind of a more masculine figure here on the left, right? The Bodhisattva of compassion is also associated in Japan with ushering souls from one rebirth to another, right? And that's what's actually happening in this particular and very, very famous China or Japanese painting. In Tibet, um, is again masculine and really very closely associated as the patron kind of deity in many ways of Tibet. And there he goes by the name of Chenrezig. And you can see an image there on the right. Speaking of Tibet, this also is thought to be a manifestation of the of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, or Chenrezig, I guess we should say. The Dalai Lama is a title, right? So it means ocean teacher, as in teaching an ocean of wisdom. And so there are many Dalai Lamas, and the current one is the 14th Dalai Lama going back to the 16th century. Um, and his personal name is Tenzin Gyatso. And so and the Dalai Lama is thought to be the Bodhi in Tibet, the Bodhisattva of compassion, fulfilling that mission to come back again and again and again in order to bring people towards enlightenment, right? So you probably know this when a Dalai Lama dies, the search goes out for the next Dalai Lama because of the idea of samsara and reincarnation, right? Um, when this Dalai Lama dies, he's going to go through that transition at the after he dies, and then find his way back, right, to our realm, right? Because he is ultimately a manifestation of the Bodhisattva of compassion and be born in a different body somewhere. And the search will go out, right, among the Tibetans, right? The Tibetan monastic community will go and look for this figure and find the Tulku, right, as it's called. And that person, right, whoever that is, will become the next Dalai Lama. But it's actually the same person, right, just fulfilling this title, right? Um, so this too is a manifestation, according to Tibetans anyway, of the Bodhisattva of compassion. Of course, the current Dalai Lama is in exile since the Chinese invasion of Tibet. Um, and he is in exile in northern India and is getting on in years. And so that whatever that transition that happens it's going to be relatively soon, probably. Best wishes to the Dalai Lama for a long life, but he is getting older and has talked very frankly about that because that's what you do if you're a Buddhist, right? So bodhisattvas, right? Another really important emphasis in many different branches of the Mahayana tradition. So now, just a couple more contrasts between conceptual and doctrinal and practical distinctions within between these two branches of the tradition. Um, Again, in the Theravadan tradition, we have an ideal that's commonly called the Arhat ideal. Arhat means striver, someone who's striving to do something. And the Arhat ideal, right, that encapsulates kind of the way that Theravadan Buddhists look at the path, right, is that, you know, we go from lifetime to lifetime and we try to apply Buddhist Dharma and Buddhist teachings. And eventually, hopefully, we reach the point where we're solidly in a position to live our lives in a monastic setting, right? As monks, right, for example, or nuns, depending on which community you're talking about. But to join a monastic community to absolutely devote ourselves to core Buddhist teachings, the Noble Eightfold Path, and meditation in particular, when we finally get to that point. And even as monks, we have to work lifetime after lifetime in order to reach the kind of highest levels of awareness and enlightenment, the highest kind of levels of arhatship, right? And there are legendary figures like this, right, who are paragons within the Theravadan tradition, arhats who have gone so far along that they're, getting really, really close, right? And they have a kind of legendary status. And eventually, all of us can go down that path, and someday, many, many lifetimes off in the future, we will ourselves attain enlightenment just as the Buddha did. Um, that's an ideal that is quite strenuous, right? And so in the Mahayana tradition, there's a little bit more of a democratization, as I mentioned before, a little bit more openness because it was just thought that that seems like a very narrow and austere path, right, for anyone interested in Buddhism to follow and contemplate. So we have different kind of ideas, right? There's also in the Bodhisattva ideal, the first premise is, as I mentioned before, we're all Bodhisattvas as soon as we get on the path, right? So we're all kind of getting there in a sense, making progress, right? As soon as we're on that path. And in some sense, have a similarity to, there's a continuity between us and the most enlightened practitioners, the celestial bodhisattvas like Avalokiteshvara. Um, we follow this path of compassion and wisdom, and there is a kind of parallel structure within Mahayana Buddhism to the Eightfold Path. It's not like the Eightfold Path is caught cast aside. It's just there's a kind of different configuration of its values in Mahayana Buddhism with a much heavier emphasis on the compassion side of things, right? That the fundamental message that the Buddha was trying to communicate and the fundamental message of Buddhist Dharma in general is that you can't separate out compassion and kind of meditative enlightenment, introspection, insight, awareness, all this kind of stuff. So remember, like the kind of loving kindness meditation that one of the readings talked about, and is a crucial meditation for many Buddhists. Is the idea of putting ourselves in the place of others and putting aside our anger and being compassionate with all sentient beings. This becomes a big emphasis in Mahayana. It's not like Theravadan Buddhists are not compassionate, right? We know that there are values, right, within the Noble Eightfold Path, right, that are very much about, doing the right thing and avoiding harm to others and all of that kind of thing. It's just a question of emphasis and where it falls in the kind of hierarchy of Buddhist belief. And for Mahayana Buddhists, as you see in the Avalokitesh, for example, he's on the cusp of nirvana. He's at the very highest level of accomplishment. And what does he do? He engages in a vow that is quintessentially an expression of compassion. So, a path, the Bodhisattva ideal, is a path that emphasizes both compassion and wisdom and how they intersect with each other. We also have different ideas about enlightenment, right, within Mahayana schools, ideas that are maybe more similar to the Theravada way of understanding things, is that it's a process, right, that you have to go through, and a long process, and a rigorous one, but also the idea that you get little hints of enlightenment along the way on the path. It's not like it's just like a threshold off somewhere, you know, way out in the future, right? And it's kind of all or nothing. No, the idea is that yes, it's a gradual process, but at each stage there's some little bit of, say, nirvana in our experience. There are also some Mahayana Buddhists who suggest that enlightenment can happen in a flash, right? That if we just shift our orientation just enough, right, enlighten nirvana will just appear, right, in a sense, will erupt. And in that moment, at least, we have experienced enlightenment, right? It may be a temporary phenomenon or it may be a permanent one, but it can be the kind of thing that just kind of creeps up on us if we're, positioned in the right way. This is particularly reflective of Zen teachings, which we'll talk about in the last unit of the class. Now, finally, philosophically, there is a doctrine or pairing of doctrines that really, again, gets at the kind of orientational difference between these two branches of the tradition. In the Theravadan tradition, you'll recall that we studied the no self doctrine. And the no self doctrine, in essence, is that way of pulling ourselves apart, seeing us as constantly evolving set of components, as opposed to some essential self identity, ego, something along those lines, right, which resides at our core essence. Adhering to that kind of idea, according to the fundamental teachings of the historical Buddha, is the ultimate impediment to achieving alleviation of suffering and nirvana, right? If we remain attached to some concept of the self, unitary self, we are going to be relentlessly attached not only to ourselves, but we are going to have the entity that goes out there in the world and says, I want this, I want that, right? And so if you don't attain that kind of realization about the self via the no self doctrine as experienced in meditation, etc., according to Theravadan Buddhists, um, you're not going to get to the ultimate goal, right? You're not going to make progress. So very important in the Theravada tradition. Now, in Mahayana philosophy, they expand that idea, right, into a concept called emptiness, right? Now, that sounds kind of negative, right? But what it really is about is saying that nothing, right, um, nothing in our experience, right, not only ourselves, but nothing in the world has its own quintessential, essential identity, right? So it's extending no self to pretty much all reality. And so what it is that makes things what they are is their actual interrelatedness, right? There's no kind of essence to the cup, right? There's no ultimate cup there, right? But the cup becomes something that it is, right, in my relationship to the cup, right? And we are the same way. There's no essential I there, right? But we become what we are, right, in quotes, right, by the relationships that constitute us, our relationship with the material world, our relationship with nature, our relationship to things, our relationship to people. So we are the product of this interconnectedness, right? And all things are that way. That is, in essence, what the emptiness doctrine is all about. What it means, right? Well, it means a lot of different things for different Mahayana Buddhists, but one thing it means is that, according to some, it suggests that there's no difference between this reality and Buddhist Dharma, or what's often called the Buddha mind, right? So, in a classical traditional way of thinking about things, there was this guy back there in history, Siddhartha Gautama. He did all this remarkable stuff, and that guy attained enlightenment over there. And then what we're supposed to do is kind of follow what he did and follow his model. And then we can attain something that's equivalent to what he attained. If you apply the emptiness doctrine, Mahayana Buddhism, why should we say there's any essential difference between the experience of that guy over there and not only ourselves, but all reality, right? The idea is that Buddha mind is everywhere, right? That enlightenment is present, right, throughout reality. It's within ourselves, right? It's within the world around us. It's in all sentient beings, right? It's present, and we just need to understand it and realize it. Peel back the layers and see that kind of connectedness, and the presence of Buddha mind in all things. All things, right, in this sense are Buddha. There is no reason to make a distinction. Another way of understanding this, and I think this is interesting in terms of contemporary debates around, let's say, gender, for example. Another application of the emptiness doctrine in some schools is that it breaks down binaries, right? So, in just picking up on the previous example, we're over here, right? And the Buddha's over there. Now, if nothing has essential identity, right, we break down the boundaries between subject and object, right? So emptiness is a tool to help us realize that actually the Buddha's enlightenment is here, not some external doctrine to be pursued and understood out there, but it actually we break down those boundaries between ourselves and the other, and we realize that we carry the Buddha's enlightenment within us, right? Once again, if we know how to uncover it. And here's an interesting one that I'll leave you with, and this actually kind of segues into Zen Buddhism, which is the next unit. The binary between samsara and nirvana, right? If we break down that binary, right, which suggests here we are in this realm over here, and then nirvana's off over there somewhere, right? The emptiness doctrine tells us that there's ultimately no distinguishing essential identity to anything. If that's the case for samsara and nirvana as supposed binaries, they break down, right, and they interweave with each other. So what does that mean? That means nirvana is in the here and the now if we know how to discover it. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there, and the last unit in the course will pick up on some of these themes when we talk about Japanese forms of Buddhism and Zen in particular.